Good afternoon, and thank you ever so much for joining us this afternoon for this really timely and interesting conversation on communications-based approaches to countering violent extremism. I'm speaking to you from a field in the south of France, and so I will apologise in advance for the cockerel next door that has just started going off. Hopefully he won't interrupt us too much. My name is Dr. Kate Ferguson, and it is a great pleasure to be here with all of you and chairing this conversation. This event is the next in a series of conversations tied to publications led by the wonderful team at RUSI for their prevention project. And we're here today to be talking about preventing and countering violent extremism through communications-based approaches. Anyone who knows RUSI's work will know that they have been making a really important contribution to this developing and growing field for some time. This conversation today is coming, I think, really from a really fantastic publication from Michael that is recently released, looking at the evidence base for communications-based approaches to CVE. I commend that report to all of you. I think it makes a very important and welcome contribution to this sort of growing field. I'm constantly amazed that there aren't more people looking at the gaps where evidence is and drawing it into spaces where it is not, and acknowledging where the gaps exist completely, and that some work continues to be done without that evidence base. So real congratulations to Michael for that paper. My own work in this field comes from some work that I did actually about 4 or so years ago, which was a similar kind of project to review the evidence that was publicly available relating to how communications-based approaches can contribute to reducing the likelihood of violent extremism and other forms of identity-based violence. So it's those questions around efficacy and evidence and the role that communications and words and expression plays in both facilitating and encouraging violence and also reducing it. I am perhaps a friendly skeptic in the room because I come at, I suppose, this conversation from the review that I did and the work that Protection Approaches does, which is very rooted in communities, that has seen perhaps some of the negative impacts of communications-based strategies when they are not done well. But that does not mean at all that these questions don't need to be answered. We live in a communications-led world, and all of these threats continue to sadly worsen and become more of a concern. And so we need to look to wherever there is evidence and efficacy and learn from that. So I am very excited to hear from all of our panelists who are going to give some short presentations, and of course from all of you in the audience for your questions. It is my very great pleasure to introduce you to our panelists today. We have a great collection of talent and different perspectives here that I'm really looking forward to sort of learning from and perhaps posing some questions of my own. It's a real treat to be with all of you. First of all, we have Michael Jones from RUSI, who is the author of this excellent paper. Michael is a fellow at RUSI's terrorism and conflict team and has been examining political violence, conflict economies, and the convergence of violent extremism, as well as insurgent militancy in Eastern Sub-Saharan Africa for some time. He has worked out of RUSI's Nairobi office, and he has led field work in a number of countries, including Sudan, Kenya, and Lebanon. And he will be speaking, I hope, to the framework and impact and implications of his excellent paper. We're then going to hear from Priyank Mathur, who is a founder and CEO of Mythos Labs, which is a fascinating company that uses entertainment and technology to counter violent extremism and online misinformation. Mythos Labs has conducted CVE programs, I think, over 12 countries on behalf of clients that include the US State Department. And I think before working with Mythos, Priyank served as a policy advisor and in intelligence in the Office of the Security of the US Department for Homeland and Security, and I think was involved in some of those policy developments and those frameworks of CVE strategy. So coming at this conversation from both sides, which is always very, very welcome. Then we have Mika Clark, who is Principal and Director of Product at Moonshot CVE, which is a London-based social enterprise dedicated to what they call disrupting violent extremism. Mika directs Moonshot's technical and professional development programs, and prior to joining Moonshot, Mika also managed US Department of Defense technical and training missions in related to open source intelligence. And so again, comes from sort of the practical state implications of these questions, as well as the spaces outside the state that obviously have very different jobs, especially when it comes to communications. So the rules of the day are everything this afternoon is on the record. It is going to be recorded and streamed on various channels. Please do then tweet away and talk about the brilliant things that the panelists have to say, and pose some questions that perhaps they can ask, answer in future, even if you can't answer them via the Zoom invite only text box. I will be doing my best. Sorry, there's flies on me because I'm in the garden. I will be doing my best to manage your excellent questions as they come through, and hopefully throwing some of my own in. And I think we're just set for a fascinating Tuesday afternoon chat. So, Michael, do you want to kick us off? Let's try and stick to 5 to 6 minutes so we get as much of a spectrum of conversation and question and answers as we can get, and we can get going without further ado. Over to you, Michael.
Great, thank you very much. So as Dr. Ferguson's highlighted, the Prevention Project is a multi-year review funded by the Norwegian government that Rusi's been leading to try and understand what works and what doesn't across various different intervention types in the PCVE space, with the hope that this then feeds into improving future programming and projects. The most recent report looks at PCVE communications specifically, and it was quite interesting that this category really enjoyed the greatest volume of literature sort of associated with it. That said, despite the the density of material we had to work from, it seemed that there were some limitations in terms of the depth and breadth of the literature that I think may be worth just highlighting quickly from the outset. So from our review, it sort of seemed that the literature largely neglected a diverse suite of activities that are typically included under the sort of umbrella term of strategic communications. And there seemed to be an almost reductive preoccupation in many cases, not universally, but in many cases, with counter-narratives specifically. And this left sort of little insight, relatively speaking, into the other dynamics and mechanisms that are involved in comms-based interventions. There was also a tendency to recycle a relatively small cluster of case studies over and over again. And the literature seemed to be remarkably insular in many respects. There were limited references to cross-cutting theories and lessons from other disciplines, including communication studies, psychology, theology, history, and so on, that were relevant and could well help influence some of the directions of these activities, but were not necessarily sort of fully thrashed out. And so what you ended up with is a literature that seemed oversaturated in certain respects, particularly in relation to counter-narrative work, technical prescription, sort of guidance and how-to sort of manuals and so on, and yet underdeveloped in many others. And so the report tries to highlight these key gaps that seem to emerge. What was also interesting was a lack of depth really across the literature as a whole. I think this is symptomatic in many respects of the PCVE space more widely. But in terms of PCVE comms, there seemed to be a focus primarily at output level findings, and particularly in terms of online interventions, there were often, again, not always, but often, there was often a reliance on so-called vanity metrics, so how many views or shares a particular piece of content received, which makes it difficult to extrapolate out to understand how, to what degree cognitive or behavioral change was actually achieved in the recipient audience. The report also tries to highlight a couple of problematic assumptions that I think continue to frame the space in many respects. I won't go through all of them now, but just sort of to flag a couple of key ones. So there remains a sort of relatively common overarching assumption of sort of linear pathways between the consumption of extremist content and violent behavior. I think the research has subsequently contested that quite a lot, but this is a premise that keeps reappearing over and over again in many different sort of forms across the space. And I also think there's potentially sort of an overemphasis on the ideological dimension of some of these issues. This isn't to say that ideology isn't important, but it potentially underplays some of the structural and enabling variables that actually foster appeal of violent extremist content in the first place, and neglects the wider ecology and social milieu that actually frame how people receive and interpret content. What was also interesting was the literature itself is aware and acknowledges in many respects these assumptions. These aren't novel findings in many cases, and yet what we see is that these assumptions persist and they continue to frame a lot of the work that goes on. And so there seems to be a bit of a disjuncture between the lessons that are sort of surfacing out of the literature and then how these lessons are actually being applied or not applied in practice. And so that was one of the key things we thought important to flag. I should also preface that most of the findings coming out of the report are subject to the limitations of the methodology we use. So we were reliant on publicly available documentation. We did receive some internal material from stakeholders that were shared with us, but ultimately this left us limited in two respects. One was that we weren't necessarily privy to some of the discussions that actually frame a lot of these projects. So the assumptions could well have been critiqued, but it was just an internal conversation that we weren't able to see. And secondly, there's always a bit of a time lag in the when it comes to the literature. So it doesn't necessarily reflect where the field is currently and where the innovations are going. I think that my fellow panelists can possibly talk to some of the what works and what doesn't in a bit more detail. But there was just one thing I thought pertinent to flag just from our own study, and that was the striking insularity of many messaging campaigns that we looked at, where messages were essentially crafted and broadcast, but without any sort of complementary programming to back it up. And I think this has sort of two critical shortcomings. One was the creation of say-do gaps, so either contradictions between the message and the actions of the stakeholders actually pumping it out, or if the message is advocating a particular alternative pathway but doesn't provide sort of opportunities or tools to achieve that, that can lead to frustrated expectations. And secondly, it also in many respects, in focusing on the message purely, you potentially neglect some of the emotional investment, the friendships and the affective bonds that basically frame and condition messages and imbue them with meaning. And so in only sort of successfully countering or rebutting a message, but neglecting that wider network that actually in many respects sort of underpins and facilitates recruitment and radicalization, you really only speak to the symptoms of the problem without necessarily grappling with those underlying dynamics. Just to conclude, I'd say, those projects that sort of tackled those issues more holistically, that engaged in one-to-one conversations, that tried to focus on relationship building and trust building, did seem to have more traction. But one of the limitations was, these are costly, these are labor intensive, and they're very time consuming. And one of the big gaps in the literature was that there seemed to be little investigation into how to scale up and systematize these more sort of idiosyncratic, participatory-led, one-to-one sort of engagements in a way that allowed them to be sustainable. So I'll leave it there for now, but I'm happy to sort of expand on any of that going forward.
Thank you. That was a lot crammed into 6 or so minutes. Thank you so much. I was tempted to be a terrible chair and just let you keep going, but thank you very much for keeping to time. Moving then swiftly on, Priyank, please tell us some of the work that you have been doing, and please, if possible, sort of try and draw some attention perhaps to sort of the principles and lessons that you have worked in your career, and sort of bring to bear maybe some answers to those implicit questions that Michael has sort of teed up for you and Mika. Thank you so much.
So thank you all. Thank you very much to Rusi, and congratulations, Michael, on a really well-written paper. Yeah, so as Kate very kindly introduced, I run Mythos Labs. We use entertainment and technology to counter harmful narratives and misinformation. And a lot of the work we do is on PCV communications. And I cut my teeth as working on CVE at the US Department of Homeland Security many administrations ago. So I think I could just sort of jump right into, I was framing my thoughts in terms of what have, in my experience from government and now working as a practitioner, what have I seen, what have I been a part of that works and that doesn't work, to put it very bluntly. So before upsetting everybody by talking about what we're all doing wrong, I'll focus on what I've seen that's going right, in my opinion. I think that one of the things we decided early on as a company is that we wanted to focus on couching PCVE messaging in entertainment. And I think overall that has been a win. I'm not saying it's a perfect approach or always suitable, but in the contexts where it was appropriate, we've been able to back that up with some evidence. I'm glad Mika's on the call. We actually did a project with Moonshot recently in Southeast Asia, looking at whether or not comedic CVE messages, videos are more effective in terms of drawing people's attention and leading to hopefully attitudinal and behavioral change than non-comedic messages or non-entertaining ones. And we found, the sort of bottom line is that yes, they attracted people's attention much more and seemed to be something that folks at different risk levels were more drawn to. But on that line, sort of another thing to talk about what Mika was mentioning, which I think is a very valid point, is how do we look at beyond the likes and the views? How do we actually look at what's causing people to change, or maybe at least inducing specific reactions? We've found we're making progress. It's a difficult question to answer, but we found some degree of success making progress using AI and machine learning in that sense, which wasn't an option 10 years ago when I was at Homeland Security, or certainly wasn't being done very commonly. So to give you one example, this is what we're doing. I'm sure there's many other companies that have different approaches as well. But when we come up with a PCV video now, we focus group it, but instead of just focus grouping it with a group that we think sort of fits the target risk profile and then just generally asking them how they felt, we use image recognition algorithms that are watching the people watching the video in real time and detecting changes in micro expressions. So, at minute 142, Michael's left eyebrow moved up by 0.02 centimeters. And we know 96% of the time that's a signal for anxiety or something. So we know maybe we shouldn't mention, this line or talk about this sensitive topic because that's made a lot of people anxious. So we've used that to build a wealth of knowledge that we then use to iterate and make each subsequent video better. So now we've got a database where we know in country X, here are the topics that make people anxious, that make people happy, that make people, nostalgic, et cetera, et cetera. And we're able to fine tune and more precisely engender the types of reactions that we're going for in people. I think in terms of what's not been as effective from what we've done and what we've observed, one thing is certainly when we've been message dominance, I think is the way Michael very eloquently put it in his paper. But that's the idea that, that the message is sort of king. And if we have a great message, the CVE, PCVE content will definitely work, whether it's a video or a tweet or even an offline intervention. That's of course not the case. Lots of studies have demonstrated that. I don't remember who said it, but I think some advertising mogul in the 50s or so said, media is the message. And I think that's very applicable to PCVE as well. So how we're approaching our target audiences matters just as much as the message. And sometimes campaigns don't necessarily equate the two in terms of importance. Another thing that I think we as an industry could do more on is focusing on social media literacy to make people more resilient towards extremist communications, and to sort of, as the principle goes, teaching people how to fish rather than giving them fish. It is an impossible undertaking to try and create enough counter alternative narrative videos in the world. Even if you believe that they work, surely nobody can believe that a few companies and practitioners are going to be able to create all the ones that we need. it's much more realistic to train people to create those kinds of campaigns themselves. And as Michael was mentioning, the offline component as well. So when you show somebody this video, how do you follow up with them, right? What kind of resources do you point them towards? So we've found a lot of success we've done workshops in, rural parts of Bangladesh, all the way to sort of metro areas like Kuala Lumpur, where we teach young people how they can create alternative counter-narrative videos. And I have to say, we've worked with really expensive comedians and celebrities and film writers and stuff. And sometimes the young kids in these communities that are at risk of violent extremism make much more effective and compelling videos because they're kind of in the heart of it, and they can write, what they know, so to say. So I think that's something that we are not maybe focusing as much on as I'd like to see, but hopefully that's something that the folks who are tuning in and have valuable opinions we can discuss afterwards. But in a nutshell, I'll kind of leave it at that and give Mika some time, but I look forward to the discussion.
Fabulous. Thanks so much. That was also very prompt. I didn't even have to watch the clock. So that was a lovely nutshell analysis. Thank you ever so much. Just before we move on to Mika and hear some of the work that Moonshot has been up to, just a reminder to all of our wonderful audience, please do send in your questions via the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And I'm sure then we can kind of go a bit deeper on the dimensions of the conversation that you are most interested to hear from our esteemed panelists. And for the next 5 to 6 minutes, Mika, the floor is very much yours.
Thanks, Kate. So again, my name is Micah. I work for Moonshot CVE. Moonshot's based in London, and we do a range of things: campaigns work, interventions work, capacity building, analytical services. We also do a lot of feasibility scoping for strategic communications projects and work with other organizations to try and understand whether what they're going to try and accomplish is reasonable. And then we also do monitoring and evaluation for CVE programming, both in government and for tech companies and that sort of thing, to get a sense of how that's going. So it's a nice opportunity to chat about some of these things with all of you. Many of you may have heard about the redirect method, which is the one method that we are probably best known for. As Michael points out, a lot of the sort of strategic communications work in the PCVE field, there's an availability bias to it. We only know about parts of it because they're publicly available. And so Moonshot's very well known for the redirect method precisely because we do a lot of that in the public domain, but we do a lot of work that's more focused on direct interventions and analytical work as well that helps to inform the redirect method. So just bear that in mind, and I'll sort of circle back to that as we go along. To sort of invert Priyank's approach, I'm going to go with what doesn't work first, just to kind of get it out of the way on some level, because the list of things that don't work in CVE is so long that I wanted to keep it intentionally quite short. I think there's a pretty broad consensus at this point that again, Michael phrased it nicely in the paper, kind of scattergun approaches that try to use demographics as a way to target audiences, young Muslim males and that sort of thing, simply don't work. And particularly when they're intended to sort of affect some sort of broad behavior change, I don't think it's really worth dwelling on too long, because I think there is a pretty broad consensus there. But I would mention just that there is a tendency on the part of funders to have sort of magical thinking around their theory of change on that. And often there's a certain amount of pressure from funders and government to try and affect big sweeping change among sort of really poorly defined and ethically suspect sort of targeting approaches. More to the point, I think they just often aren't informed by the sort of data and intelligence of a really good audience. And so there's a lack of preparation around understanding the audience that you're actually trying to get in touch with, not sort of in broad strokes based on theoretical and ideological sort of boundaries necessarily, but specifically, what do they look like on the internet? In the military context, you'd call it the sort of intelligence preparation of the operational environment. It's like, what does it look like? What are the community that I'm actually trying to get involved with look like online? And so intelligence-led approaches, I would say, is probably the first thing that does work that I would add to that list. So a couple of things that don't work there, but I'll focus on what does work. And I think more than anything, I think it's just approaches that are consistent with how people actually use the internet work. Approaches that are inconsistent with how people use the internet do not work. And so we always have to remember that extremist users of the internet are internet users like the rest of us. And so if we understand and we reflect both on our own experience, but also learn about others' experience with how they interact with the internet, and think about it as a human experience. Think about it as a thing that doesn't just give you information and insight and that sort of thing, but actually makes you feel a particular way. And privileging that over a lot of other things will make a big difference. So in practical terms, that means really prioritizing user experience. And that goes well beyond just sort of strategic communications sort of campaigns, and gets into a lot of different types of campaigns, more intervention-oriented campaigns. The goal, again, is to diverge as little as possible from what the user's expecting to get, right, in their experience, and they want it to be familiar and have a simple user experience, a simple way to get help, a simple way to experience whatever you're putting in front of them. And most sort of generally focusing less at talking at users and more at talking with users, which increasingly as possible, I think with the right sort of preparation and the right sense for how to identify the right sort of folks online, the opportunity to interact directly with individuals is more present now than it's ever been before. And as Michael said, it's a very promising practice. It's a difficult practice to scale up, but it is promising. In line with that, again, I would sort of drive home the value of honesty and directness around a lot of our messaging. I think, you know, trying to mislead someone out of an at-risk situation is destined for failure. And so being very direct and honest with what you're trying to accomplish is important. There is often a lot of strategic communications in PCVE. They're sort of laced with a sort of sense of kind of trying to mislead people, or there's a sort of vague kind of sneaky suspicion behind it. And I would say, as much as we might need media literacy, we also need to recognize that a lot of online users today have much better BS detectors than they've ever had and in the past. And so I think a lot of people see inauthentic behavior pretty quickly. We've all experienced, and as have the at-risk audience, have all experienced being lied to enough on the internet that we're pretty good at spotting it. So directness and honesty in that context can actually be a really great strategic communications asset. If you're making an effort to be particularly direct and honest, I think you can actually set yourself apart pretty quickly. And a lot of that hinges on, again, how we define quality, how it should be defined. Again, from the funder's perspective, often it's about production value, and it's about how, you know, glisteningly beautiful whatever asset you're putting together is. But from the viewer's perspective, you know, quality is defined by their response to it, right? How does it make them feel? What does it elicit in them that is genuine? And that's actually the value. And I think that's where honesty comes in. Just to kind of pile along here relatively quickly, I think more than anything else, again, focusing less on ideology is such a great point that Michael made. There is a predisposition to that because it's something that we can all discuss. More and more, we're coming to a point where we need to make it a lot more human rather than theoretical and ideological, and really focus on the behavioral and psychosocial aspects of extremism. You know, there's a lot of debate right now about the role of former extremists and victims of terrorism in this context, because they can often tell a story that is far more compelling and has nothing to do with ideology. You know, I've seen a lot of formers talk, or I've rarely seen a former talk about ideology in a way that's compelling, but I've seen many formers talk about things that get them in and out of the movement in a way that is really, really compelling. And there's a lot of debate around that, a lot of things to consider. Again, I think providing mechanisms for people to get help offline is super valuable. A lot of case studies that potentially we could discuss later on that. The numbers are never going to be huge, but they are really successful. And then maybe just finally, the last point I would make is a slightly controversial one, which is simply that we need to look at taking differentiated approaches to different ideological groups, which is to say, not to focus on necessarily the ideological argument, but to recognize that people who are in different at-risk groups have a higher risk of harm in society more broadly, and therefore our approach to them can be different, right? So I do think, and it's appropriate, that the CVE community still has a pretty nasty hangover from a lot of the excesses of the sort of post 9/11, post 7/7 strategic communications world, and that's appropriate. You know, how those communities were treated at that time was abhorrent, and there's good reason to be chastened by that. However, we need to recognize that, for example, you know, angry white men are not securitized in the same way that you know, Muslim communities would be. And so appreciating that we can take different approaches to far-right extremism that potentially are more aggressive, frankly, because that community is not at risk of harm more broadly. And so therefore there's a sort of different risk calculus when you approach that. I think that's something that works, and we can get more into the details of that. But that community, in a general sense, is a lot happier to be discursive online and argue online. And so I think in some ways we actually need to go where our users are. around that, especially as it relates to far-right extremism, and engage with them in a different way than we might have engaged with other communities in the past. There's a lot of nuance we can bring to how we've interacted with those communities as well, but I do think that understanding different ideologies and different risk levels in terms of their broader sort of harm in society is really critical. So I think I will leave it there.
That's great. Thank you ever so much, Micah. And apologies for my mispronunciation of your name earlier. Fabulous. Well, I mean, I feel like the three of you have done a wonderful job of sort of setting a scene and managing to convey actually that despite obviously strategic communications and strategic comms within CVE as being a quite narrow field, that even within our three panelists here, we have many different entry points to go at. I do have many questions that I would like to ask you, but actually I can see some really great ones coming in from the audience. So I think I might just jump in straight from there, and then maybe I will add some at the end if we have time to squeeze them in, basically. So I'm going to start with a question from Naveen Nair, who says, perhaps the biggest challenge over the years has been to get enough evidence to show whether online PVE or CVE measures are working, or not just with its target audience. How far do you think the industry has been able to gather this evidence now, and where do we stand in the panelists' opinion on this crucial issue? So again, you know, this is speaking to evidence collection and how that can be overcome. And maybe I can just add a kind of additional dimension of where can we think about gathering the evidence of what works from spaces outside the CVE and PVE industry that relate to effective communications-based approaches to reducing violence, because I think that that is also around the same obstacle, sort of it's a collating and then an acting upon. There's always a conversation about evidence and the need for more of it. So perhaps we can sort of start with that and then drill down on maybe some more specifics. So how about Priyank and then Micah?
Sure, it's a great question, one that's confounded all of us, I think, at some point. I think that there's no silver bullet there's no way that I think any honest practitioner or donor is going to be able to tell you this campaign 100% made people less likely to become, you know, violent extremists. What you can say, and I think Kate raised a good point, is you can look at proxies from other campaigns that have been successful. So one of the things we did when we were setting up the company was study things like the you know, anti-smoking campaigns or successful and unsuccessful anti-drug campaigns, things that that we could borrow from other disciplines and say, well, what features of this campaign were people happy with, were people not happy with? And now that we can look back in hindsight sort of, and we have that clarity, what essentially worked and didn't that we can replicate. So I think that's one way to be a little bit more scientific about evidence collection, is to base your strategies on what has worked in other industries in the past and then use that as a proxy. Another thing that I think, you know, we're getting better at as an industry, I'd like to think, is more targeted evaluations. So it's really tough to say, you know, X amount of dollars have been poured into CVE, and yet more people have joined ISIS in the last 5 years. So I guess CVE isn't working, because there are just too many other variables we cannot control for, like actual policy or just, you know, 100 different reasons why someone may join or not join an extremist organization. What gets more and more precise is when you look at smaller and smaller communities that are a little more isolated from other factors. So, you know, for us, there's a couple communities in Eastern Europe where we've been doing work for a couple of years where there's really not too many other, you know, the only sort of CVE counter messaging that I think most people are seeing is it's pretty concentrated. And so you can then start to make some plausible inferences about, well, you know, we know that this population is not, you know, most people don't speak anything other than this language. These are the only CVE materials available in this language. This has been kind of the response to that. That's when you can start to maybe get a little more targeted. But the other thing I think, and this is probably an answer that maybe some, you know, that isn't necessarily popular, and at the risk of of disappointing folks. I think that we have to also let go of the hope that we'll be able to find a way to measure if CVE worked, and maybe pay equal, if not more, attention to making sure we don't do stuff that causes more harm, because that's sometimes easier to identify. And you'd be surprised by how many times the lessons of something that didn't work don't get taken into account. Because I think, as our colleague from Moonshot, very, very accurately put it, sometimes the donor incentives are not aligned with what the practitioners are. So if the idea is, well, we have funding for this thing that we did in 2017, do you want the money to do it again? And it's like, well, there were clear lessons from that thing that didn't work. Can we change that? No, because the funding's been authorized for this specific thing, and so we got to do that thing. And so there's a little bit of red tape that I think we could start to cut, that would make it a more common sense approach to, if something is, the do no harm principle, if it violates that, we should definitely avoid doing that. And these are ways to mitigate the harmful effects. So I hope that speaks to your question a little bit.
Thanks ever so much. Micah, anything to add on that?
Yeah, I suppose I think that the CVE community is really struggling with effectiveness, partly because we've never been particularly clear on how we define success. So how you collect data depends on how you define success. I think funders often want to define success as behavior change, but I would argue that particularly for online strategic communications campaigns, the notion that you could somehow do psychometric evaluation of your beneficiaries and be able to demonstrate behavior change is just remote to the point of almost absurdity. And yet, to Priyank's point, when they come to you and they say, hey, here's money to do a thing, that you want to jump for that buck, to be candid, to be very, very candid. I do think that there's value in a range of indicators that we get online. I know there is a tendency to call them vanity metrics. I tend to call them like gross metrics. Sometimes those gross metrics make a difference. You can compare between things and recognize that some of them are more successful than others, but there's plenty of metrics that are more sort of proxy oriented that Priyank mentioned as well, in terms of active choices that users have made, as opposed to just consumption and passive measures, in terms of even something as simple as a click-through rate. How many of your users actually go and look at the thing that you're looking at? How long do they dwell on the website? How many of them reach out for help? Those things matter. Are they going to demonstrate absolute behavior change? Probably not. But it really depends on how we define success in that context. Creating the opening is often the biggest sort of measure of success that we can get. And I think that measures that indicate a sort of potential opening to help someone are about as good as you can get in this field, rather than behavior change.
Thank you. Michael, anything to add, or does your paper reviewing the evidence and its recommendations for broadening out where we can get more evidence and learn from different methods and experiences speak for itself?
Hopefully. Yeah, there's certainly, there's been a lot of investment into, how-to guides to improve monitoring and evaluation for particularly local practitioners and people at the front end actually delivering a lot of this stuff. I have no doubt that a lot of the metrics and ways to monitor and evaluate have also been significantly improved. Beyond what is publicly available, I imagine a lot of the metrics are significantly better, or what we see in the fairly limited number of program evaluations isn't necessarily sort of where the forefront of this thinking currently is. I would say that just on that point, there has been a dearth of evaluation material more broadly, and I think that is ultimately part of the problem. PCV communications actually had, relatively speaking, a slightly greater proportion of programmatic evaluation content available than other intervention types that we looked at, but this is still a real problem in terms of actually getting an understanding of what's happening in the space more generally. The only other quick point I think worth mentioning, and I think it touches on those, that sort of misalignment between practitioners and donors sometimes, is a point that's often made by some of my colleagues who work in communications sort of programmatically rather than from just a research standpoint. And that's sort of appreciating the sort of process of engagement and the sort of journey that individuals who are receiving content then sort of engage engage on. And I think, you know, obviously this is very much geared towards in the online space, one-to-one conversations over a certain amount of time, or, you know, offline, you know, that becomes a lot easier. I don't think it necessarily tracks that well with, you know, the sort of typical standard set of counter narratives that are circulated, or alternative narratives, or whatever it is. But I think that sort of idea of process is one that is not necessarily fully appreciated in some of the monitoring and evaluation regimes that donors typically lean on. And yet that is where potentially, again, anecdotally, you tend to find most of the traction, if there is any, sort of emerging. So I think it's actually understanding how these programs operate and where to look in terms of any effectiveness that you're generating. That's something that I think donors particularly need to sort of, you know, have a reconsider of, a reappraisal of, partially because, you know, I know many practitioners are actually, you know, fully aware of where this is, but given the funding parameters they're operating under and everything else, it's quite hard sometimes to convey that in a way that makes sense financially.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point made by all three of you about the sort of the role of donors in this space. And I think unlike other initiatives that are run from outside of state structures, that are primarily there to, well, more than anything, try and reduce the threat of violence and save lives, actually the CVE space occupies quite an unusual hybrid of sort of private sector, social enterprise, NGO, charity, as well as sort of those state relationships. And the role of the state, I suppose, in playing catch up to what the practitioners already know, especially in terms of those sort of those vanity matrix and those sort of sexy statistics of we paid for this and it was seen X many millions of times, is a real obstacle. And I suppose my only contribution to this bit is to maybe raise a flag or sort of wave a flag for the importance of qualitative metrics and assessment when we're talking about behavior change. And of course, because a lot of communications-based approaches in CVE do tend to be online and tend to be seeking scale and delivered through technological means, there is the kind of resource of machine learning and big data, which is a miraculous kind of wealth of information, but shouldn't be pursued at the exclusion of those qualitative indicators that when we're talking about identity and who people are and why they behave in certain ways, for me at least, perhaps it's my background in humanities training rather than communications, I always think only adds important complexity. So we're going to move on to a next question that I think is somewhat related. I'm going to ask you all to keep your answers a little briefer, just so we can get through a couple of rounds. This one comes from Matt Freer saying, there is an assumption that the communications objective is to counter extremist narrative or similar. How much is this about countering, and he's got in brackets, a segment of population sense of meaning, grievance, inclusion, and narrative? And so I suppose that speaks to the kind of wider methodological approach to what a counter narrative or counter messaging or comms-based approach might be, which I'm sure we would love to hear from you all on. But let's go Michael Priyank, if that's okay.
Sure. So yeah, I think I see the kind of point behind the question, which is that, you know, beyond just focusing on narrative, can we focus on a wider sort of set of social conditions that lead someone to get interested in those narratives, which I think is definitely one important approach, though it's also, I think, been tried a lot. Years ago, when I first got into this field, I went to a conference, and I think the outcome of the entire conference is we need to build more basketball courts. You know, we need to provide spaces where people can go and play and this kind of stuff. And it's like, yeah, but what, like, how does that focus on this problem? So I think it is relevant. I would take that question and spin it around a little bit and think about all of those issues that were highlighted in terms of grievance and inclusion, and think of them at the individual level, and think about how we can tailor concern and questions about that to the individual experience of sort of living that life rather than a sort of community experience. That would be maybe my only tune, but I absolutely think that it's relevant. And I think we can go even deeper. I think we can get down into a lot more personal mental health and sort of sort of well-being questions. And I think that that's a really promising area as well.
Great, thank you. Michael.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with everything that Mike has just said, really. I think, you know, one of the things that really resonated throughout the report is the sort of value of integrated projects. And when you have messages that simply aim to tackle the narrative, but don't necessarily either tackle that wider ecosystem or provide complementary programming that sort of shows you are doing what you say you want to do or should do. You know, where those elements are lacking, I think there's a clear discrepancy in outcome. I'd also say just that idea of countering itself is quite interesting. I mean, one of the sort of memes in this space is that alternative narratives are significantly better in terms of outcome relative to more conventional counter narratives. And what was interesting, and again, you know, I preface this by saying it was limited, I guess, by the material that we were able to sort of engage with, but the actual empirical evidence suggesting that was somewhat limited. You know, so where there were alternative narratives that were backed up with, you know, individually focused engagement, conversation, avenues for empowerment and expression, then potentially there seemed to be some traction. But alternative narratives as simply well, counter narratives don't work, therefore we will do this instead. It didn't actually seem to be necessarily backed up by evidence. That's not to say they don't work, but it's to say that actually this is, you know, a claim that at least in publicly available literature, not necessarily as concrete as it would appear.
Great, thank you. And Priyank.
Great. Well, they both said some really intelligent things that I agree with. I'll just add one more point, and this kind of dovetails on what Micah had said about the mental health aspect. So there's a quote, you know, Maya Angelou said it more eloquently than I. She said, people will forget what you did, they'll forget what you said, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. And I think that what I tell our writers whenever we're making stuff is just focus on how you're making the viewer feel, because what we're really countering is not a narrative or even a grievance. I mean, we are on some level, but on a deeper level, we're countering a feeling, as mushy as that sounds, and we're trying to engender certain others. So, you know, not to get too abstract artistic on that, but I do think that that's one way, one lens we keep on while designing counter or alternative narrative videos.
Sure. I'm sort of tempted to zoom us out even further. Actually, I was so struck when reading Michael's paper that the CVE communication space, or certainly the way that Michael, I think, succeeded in presenting it, that there has been a quite thoughtful broadening of stakeholders who are involved. There's been somewhat of a shift to include a slightly more varied evidence of spectrum of evidence and methods, even though I think we can all agree that that could be done much more. But I also think that there has perhaps been in some areas, of course, this is not universal, but a clarification about what strategic communications in CVE and PVE can do and what it can't do. And I don't know if that is shared by the three of you. And I wonder if I can put you all on the spot now and just ask each of you to sort of sum up in a sentence. You know, if you were to have to answer the question of what is the change that good comms-based approaches to countering or preventing violent extremism is trying to make, and implicit in that is acknowledging the limitations of comms-based CVE and PVE, because I feel like if we're able to answer that question, then we also get to the heart of Michael's point he makes in his paper about the lack of a diversity of methodological approaches, cross-working with other practice. You know, we might be able to see how those bridges between peace building and CVE, for example, could be made much better. And I wonder if the CVE comms community could lead the way. So can I just go round? Let's go in opposite order. Priyank, Micah, and then Michael. What is the good change that good comms-based CVE is trying to make?
So I think that's a great question. I think, to put it in a nutshell, you're trying to make the viewer see their reality but from a different perspective than they're used to seeing it. So, you know, if that's a counter narrative video, you don't want to distort their reality. You want to say, hey, you were wrong. Your reality is actually X. You thought it was Y. No, your reality is what you thought, but have you ever thought about looking at it from this way? And I think that's no different than what a moving novel or an Oscar-winning picture does, or, you know, and we should be okay saying that. You know, sometimes if you compare CVE to sort of, like you were saying, Kate, you know, there's been an effort to try and broaden it, but it hasn't been as extensive as I'd liked, because sometimes if you start comparing CVE to too many other things, people just say, well, you don't get CVE, because it's not like that. We're this very special, very niche thing. It has nothing to do with any other communication form. But, you know, on some level, we're making communications, and that's what a lot of people do around the world, do it really successfully. There's no shame in learning from that. So that's my take. Make people see their reality from a different perspective.
Great, thank you. Micah.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think the change we're trying to make is just creating openings. This is a way to think about it, is, you know, creating an opening for someone to consider a different perspective. We've done a bunch of research on integrative complexity and cognitive complexity as a thing that potentially, you know, we could affect online, but long and short of it is that's really hard to do. But secondly, and I think probably most importantly, I think the golden ring right now is creating an opening for people to seek help off the internet, basically, to seek help where they are. And if we can start accomplishing that in a more consistent way and evidence it in a more consistent way, I think we will have succeeded.
Great, Michael.
I don't really have anything to add beyond that, to be honest. I got the lucky draw in that one, so yeah, I'll happily leave it with those two.
That's interesting. I mean, I always feel, because I get to jump from different corners of this conversation, hearing how other people define you know, sort of what this challenge is, I always find really interesting. Thank you for indulging me, and hopefully that was also useful in sort of then following on to these next questions. We have a great many to go through. I'm now going to ask one from so I think we're gonna let's have this one in our chat box from Alexander Charlie, which is delivery of CVE online is often seen to be the responsibility of the government, yet much of the technical skill is in the private sector. What evidence is there of successful cooperation between public and private sectors in this endeavor? I feel like this is very much one for both Micah and Priyank. So let's go in that order, and Michael can then jump in.
Yeah. Concrete, I mean, the evidence of success there remains the same sort of evidence of success for anything else that we've described. I think on some level, what the questioner is getting at is the unique challenge of coordinating public and private. But I would tell you, and Priyank, you can say differently, but almost all CVE programming, almost, is government funded and private sector or like NGO implemented, right? So the evidence of success is the field, essentially. Like pretty much everything in the field happens in that context. The government, definitely there's occasions where I definitely can think of the US, you know, the CENTCOM web ops team that was, you know, trying to do government-led CVE programming, mostly staffed by contractors incidentally, but it's very rare. And so I think probably the real opportunity of using private sector is both the technical skill, but also potentially the resourcefulness of being able to identify credible voices. I think typically we tend to be better at that than government in general. But I would generally say, again, it's kind of a weird way to answer that question, but really most of the field consists of that. And so the way we measure the success of that is about the same that we'd measure the success of any other part of the field.
Great, thank you. Priyank.
Yeah, totally agree with that. I think most of the programming we've been exposed to has been a public-private partnership. So in that sense, there's good evidence that funding is going to the private sector. But I think the essence of the question is very valid. And it's not just the private sector. You take a bunch of people who are doing the exact same thing that the government is doing, except they're just making more money doing it. And then you give them the money. That's not really, you know, solving the problem. So I think the question is also, what parts of the private sector are you going to? Is it the same folks who've been doing this? But by folks, I don't mean companies or individuals, but I mean the same mindsets. Or are we bringing in, you know, people, comedians or travel vlog? We're making a CVE video right now in Libya with a travel vlogger, which if you told me that, you know, 5 years ago, I would have said that makes no sense, but it's kind of working because he's just very popular in the region and he gets it. And so I think we shouldn't be scared to bring in different parts of the private sector we're not used to working with.
Great. Now, Michael, forgive me because I'm going to ask one, what will have to be our last question. And I think it tails on actually from our previous one, sort of about this relationship with different actors. And I want to give all three of you a chance to come in on this. So this is from an anonymous attendee, which says, funding has been mentioned a number of times. There is a finite number of funding for CVE and PVE programs, with the majority coming from governments. Comms-based approaches are particularly popular among funders because they are sold as cheap ways to reach masses. Yet, as panelists have discussed, for community-based or education programs working, oh no, sorry, I've misread that. Yeah, as panelists have discussed, evidence of the efficacy of this approach seems weak. And then the argument is there is plenty of evidence for community-based or education programs working in the fields of genocide prevention, peace building, community cohesion, etc. Do the panelists worry that focusing on communications approaches might take away from community and education-based approaches in a time of financial restriction that we know work, which build broad, long-lasting resilience against identity-based hate and violence? And I suppose that's about thinking about the contribution that strategic communications and comms-based approaches to countering or preventing violent extremism fit in with that larger ecosystem of attempting to reduce the likelihood of violence, reduce the number of perpetrators, ultimately reduce the number of victims. And sort of, if we're in a fight for resources, to be very blunt, as a number of you have already in your comments about funding, can you comment on the value and strength of CVE comms communication when there is not the efficacy proved there when there is in other fields, basically, which is an interesting question. So let's just go round in order. Let's have Michael, then Micah, then Priyank. If you can keep your...
very interesting question. I just had a couple of thoughts on it. I think from my end, just based, and I'm certainly not a communications expert. I can only sort of draw on, sort of experience in the PCVE space. But I'd suggest that if communications is done correctly, it shouldn't be a sort of zero-sum either-or proposition. It should be, communication should be used to complement, depending on the context, to complement those wider, broader-based programs, either to help sort of package it, to help build on what those programs are trying to achieve, and what have you. So I think, in that sense, it's a bit of a red herring to suggest it is either or. I appreciate there are obviously finite resources available, but the whole point of communications, when used strategically, is it should cut across different programs. So I think it's not to say that PCVE shouldn't be used instead of those recommendations, but that they can coexist and should coexist in a way that, speaks to that wider ecosystem of violence that often frames violent extremism specifically. So I think, they should work together. I think, just as a sort of concluding point, I think one of the issues with the violent extremist element of this specifically is that, what we're actually trying to achieve and what success looks like arguably is a bit more contentious or a bit more subjective in this space relative to broader peace building or whatever else you're trying to do. So I think possibly that's where some of this complication sort of creeps into it. But to summarize, I think essentially comms can supplement. It shouldn't be used in place of. But it shouldn't be excluded either. It is an integral component of anything else you are trying to do, whatever that may be.
Great, thank you. And sorry, but I've just realized we've had such a wonderful time talking. We're running out of time. So Micah, if you could try and sum that big question up in 60 seconds, I'd be very grateful.
My concern that stratcoms approaches are consuming too much money as it relates to PCVE, yes. But I would say that increasingly, stratcoms projects allow folks like Mythos and folks like Moonshot to actually work with other smaller players that are doing a lot more of that fine-grained work. And a lot of the contract vehicles are recognizing that and enabling it. So government's coming around to it. There's actually a lot more money for non-stratcom stuff coming out of government as well.
Great, thank you. And finally, Priyank.
Yeah, very quickly, I echo that. And I think most of the programs we're seeing are integrated approaches, sometimes with the non-stratcoms piece leading. So we're headed in the right direction.
Fabulous. Well, thank you all three of you for your contributions, your good humor, your excellent timekeeping, and for lots of food to thought. I'm so sorry we couldn't get to more of those questions. I urge the panelists to have a look through, and you know, they are worth thinking about, and I always wish these conversations could go on longer. But I feel like ending at a point of communication should complement, and looking at the integration of what has been learnt from this field, and for the wider challenges, and what has been learned in other fields for the specifics of communications-based approaches to violent extremism, is sort of maybe the next era of this field. It has been a real pleasure speaking to all of you, and to be with those of you that I can't see but know are with us from this corner of France. And I think I'll just say thank you very much. We can't really do a round of applause, but thank you very much to the panelists. Read Michael's excellent report, and have lovely rest of your days. So thanks ever so much.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.